Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Skinwalker Ranch. We begin in the autumn of 1994, as Terry and Gwen Sherman arrive at their new home in the Uinta Basin, unaware that they have just crossed into a landscape of ancient legends and impossible reality. The Uinta Basin is a place of stark, desolate beauty, where the high desert of northeastern Utah meets a sky so vast it feels heavy with the secrets of the past. The air here is thin and carries the faint, sharp scent of sage and sun-baked earth. To the north, the Uinta Mountains stretch in an unusual east-to-west direction, their jagged peaks forming a permanent barrier against the rest of the world. It is a land of silence, but not a peaceful one. The Shermans were looking for a fresh start, a place where they could raise their prized cattle far from the noise of the city. They found it in a 512-acre spread near the small town of Ballard. As they drove their truck through the rusted gate for the first time, the tires crunched over gravel that had not felt the weight of a vehicle in over 7 years. The property had sat vacant, a lonely island of red rock and scrub brush, since the previous owners, the Myers family, had moved away. The ranch buildings were weathered, their wood silvered and cracked by the intense Utah sun. There was a peculiar stillness as the family began to unload their lives, a feeling that the land was not merely empty, but waiting for someone to return. As they explored their new home, Terry and Gwen noticed things that did not quite fit the profile of a standard cattle ranch. On the doors and windows of the main farmhouse, the previous owners had installed heavy, industrial-grade deadbolts, but they were not designed to keep people out. These locks were on the inside, as if the inhabitants were terrified of something entering from the exterior and were desperate to seal themselves within the safety of the four walls. Even the kitchen cabinets had been fitted with thick metal chains and padlocks. There were no explanations left behind, only the cold iron of the bolts and the lingering sense of a long-held breath. They laughed it off at first, attributing it to the eccentricities of the elderly couple, but the weight of those locks remained. The geography of the ranch is dominated by a long, imposing ridge of sandstone that looms over the northern pastures. The Ute people have whispered about this ridge for generations. They call it the Path of the Skinwalker, a forbidden stretch of ground where malevolent shapeshifters are said to travel. The Shermans, however, were practical people. They were ranchers, focused on the health of their Angus herd and the rhythm of the seasons. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on one of those early autumn evenings, painting the sandstone in shades of deep violet and blood orange, the boundary between the practical and the impossible began to blur. The wind began to whistle through the crevices of the ridge, sounding less like a breeze and more like a low, rhythmic chanting from the depths of the earth. It was during these first days that they encountered the wolf. It did not creep or sneak. It simply appeared in the pasture, a massive silhouette against the drying grass. Terry, an experienced woodsman and marksman, was struck by its size. It was easily 3 times the size of any wolf he had ever seen, standing nearly as tall as his chest. Its fur was a strange, shimmering silver, and its eyes were a piercing, electric blue that seemed to glow in the fading light. Most wolves are skittish around humans, but this creature showed no fear. It trotted toward the family with a calm, almost friendly gait. It was so placid that Terry and Gwen felt a strange sense of peace. One of their family members even reached out and stroked the thick, coarse fur on the animal's head. The wolf accepted the touch, its breathing slow and steady, its scent like wet dog and metallic ozone. But in a heartbeat, the atmosphere shattered. The creature turned its head toward a small calf standing in a nearby corral. With a speed that defied its massive bulk, the wolf lunged, its jaws snapping shut around the calf's head. The sound was sickening, a mixture of breaking bone and the desperate, high-pitched bleating of the young animal. Terry acted instantly. He grabbed his .357 Magnum and fired a shot directly into the wolf's ribs at point-blank range. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the ridge, but the wolf did not even flinch. It did not release the calf. Terry fired again, and then again, until he had emptied the cylinder into the beast's side. Any living thing should have been torn apart by such a barrage, yet the wolf merely looked at Terry with those cold blue eyes. There was no blood on its silver fur, no sign of a wound, and no indication of pain. It finally released the calf and began to trot away toward the brush. Terry, now gripped by a cold dread, pursued the animal, following its heavy paw prints in the soft dirt. He tracked it for nearly 400 yards until the trail reached a patch of muddy ground. There, the footprints simply stopped. The tracks did not fade or get smaller. They just vanished into nothingness, as if the creature had stepped off the face of the earth. The Shermans stood in the deepening shadows, finally realizing that the locks on their doors were there for a reason. The ground beneath Terry's boots felt solid, yet the reality unfolding before him was anything but. The air was heavy with the scent of sage and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. Just moments before, the world had made sense. A predator was attacking a calf, and a rancher's instinct was to protect his livelihood. But as the smoke cleared from the first discharge of his .35-7 Magnum, the creature did not fall. It did not even flinch. It stood perfectly still, its massive frame looming near the fence line like a monument of silver and gray. This was 1994, a year that would forever be etched into the memory of the family, as the moment the rules of the natural world were revoked. The creature was gargantuan, easily 3 times the size of any wolf Terry had ever seen in the wild or in books. Its fur was thick, shimmering with a pale, ghostly light under the Utah sun, and its eyes were a startling, unnatural shade of light blue. They weren't the yellow or amber eyes of a predator you would expect to find in the basin. They were the color of a shallow glacial lake, cold and entirely devoid of fear. Before the violence began, there had been a moment of surreal, almost hypnotic peace. The animal had approached the family with a calm that bordered on the domestic. It didn't snarl. It didn't crouch or show the jagged teeth that would soon be clamped onto the snout of a terrified calf. Instead, it had trotted up to the fence like a lost pet seeking a hand to guide it home. Terry's father, a man who had spent his life around animals of every stripe, had reached out. He had actually touched the beast, feeling the coarse, thick texture of its pelt. He later described the smell as something like rain hitting a dusty dog, a scent so ordinary that it masked the nightmare to come. The muscles beneath that silver fur had rippled with immense power, yet the creature remained passive, allowing the human touch. It was only when the wolf suddenly lunged, its jaws snapping shut on the calf through the heavy iron bars of the pen, that the facade of the friendly visitor vanished. Even then, as the family beat at it with sticks and shovels, the wolf showed no anger. It simply held on with a grip that seemed powered by something more than muscle and bone. The Magnum had barked 4 times at point-blank range. Each shot should have been a terminal event, a thunderous conclusion to the encounter. Yet, the wolf had only let go of the calf slowly, almost casually, as if it had simply grown bored with the struggle. It turned its head to look at Terry, its blue eyes meeting his with a chilling lack of expression. There was no blood. Despite the caliber of the weapon and the proximity of the muzzle, there was no red mist, no staggering, no whimper of pain. Terry felt the kick of the gun in his wrist, a physical reminder of the energy he was unleashing, but that energy seemed to vanish into the silver fur of the visitor. Frustrated and beginning to feel the first tendrils of true terror, Terry ran for his .30-06 rifle. This was a weapon designed to bring down the largest game in North America, a tool of precision and devastating force. He took aim and fired, the crack of the rifle echoing off the distant mesas like a clap of thunder. He hit it. He knew he hit it. He saw the fur fly where the bullet struck the creature's flank, yet the wolf merely stepped back, shook itself like a dog drying off after a bath, and began to trot away across the scrubland. The pursuit that followed was a descent into the impossible. Terry and his father followed the creature through the brush. Their eyes scanned the ground for the dark stains of a blood trail that should have been impossible to miss. They found nothing. No crimson droplets on the dry earth, no smears on the sagebrush. They tracked the massive paw prints, each one significantly larger than a man's hand, pressed deep into the soft mud near a creek bed that bisected the property. The tracks were clear, well-defined, and led straight toward the water. But as they reached the edge of the muddy bank, the trail simply ceased to exist. One moment, the heavy indentations were there, showing the weight of a several hundred-pound animal, and in the very next step, the ground was pristine. It was as if the wolf had simply evaporated into the thin desert air, leaving no ripple in the water and no further mark on the earth. They stood by the creek in a silence so profound it felt heavy, the only sound being the distant lowing of the injured calf back at the pens. It was during this desperate search that Terry noticed something caught on a barbed wire fence near where the wolf had made its exit. It was a small, ragged chunk of flesh and a tuft of that silver-gray hair, presumably torn away by the wire or the force of a bullet. He leaned in, expecting the iron-rich scent of fresh biology, but instead, he was met with a wave of nausea. The scrap of tissue smelled of ancient rot, a pungent, cloying odor of meat that had been dead for weeks, not seconds. It was a physical contradiction that defied every law of biology Terry knew. How could a creature that moved with such vitality, such fluid grace, be composed of rotting carrion? He didn't touch it, but the sight of that graying, bloodless lump of meat remained burned into his mind. It was the first tangible evidence that the ranch was not merely a piece of land, but a stage for something that operated outside the boundaries of life and death. The visitor at the fence had not been a wolf at all, but a harbinger of a reality where the bullet has no sting and the grave has no hold. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the basin, the weight of the encounter settled over the ranch. The calf survived, though its wounds were strange and slow to heal, leaving the family to wonder about the nature of the saliva that had touched its skin. Terry found himself looking at his guns differently that night. The steel and wood felt like toys, useless charms against a predator that could absorb 5 or 6 rounds of high-velocity lead without breaking its stride. The realization was a cold one, sinking into his bones as the desert temperature began to drop. They had moved to this place for the quiet life of cattle ranching, for the open spaces and the freedom of the Utah wilderness. But as the first stars appeared over the mesa, they realized they weren't the masters of this land. They were merely guests, and the local inhabitants were far older, far stranger, and entirely indifferent to the weapons of men. The laws of nature had been rewritten in the span of a single afternoon, and the ink was still wet. The shadows grew long across the Uinta Basin, stretching toward the red rock mesas like skeletal fingers reaching for the cooling earth. Terry Sherman stood on the edge of the pasture, his breath a faint mist in the twilight air. For a man who had spent his life among livestock, there was a rhythm to the land that should have been comforting, yet the silence of the ranch felt heavy, almost viscous. It was 1994 when the family first arrived with dreams of a quiet life, but the land had its own agenda. The lowing of the cattle usually sounded like a deep, resonant vibration of the earth itself. But lately, there was a different quality to the sound, a hollow, mournful tone that seemed to echo off the canyon walls even when the animals were still. It was the sound of a herd that knew it was being hunted by something they could not see or understand. The first time they found one of their cows, the shock was not just in the loss, but in the clinical nature of the scene. It was a clear morning when Terry discovered the heifer lying in the high grass. There was no evidence of a struggle, no flattened vegetation to suggest a predator had chased her down, and most disturbingly, not a single drop of blood. As he knelt beside the animal, He saw that her ear had been removed with a single, curving cut so precise that no serrated blade or tooth could have achieved it. The edges of the wound were clean, almost as if the tissue had been cauterized or dissolved by some technology far beyond the simple tools of a rancher. It was a level of surgical expertise that required a steady hand and a bright light, yet it had occurred in the dead of night without a single sound or witness. Perhaps the most chilling event occurred in the broad, unforgiving light of day. Terry had been tagging calves only a few hundred yards away, the sun high and bright over the basin. He had seen a healthy, vibrant calf resting in the grass just 20 minutes before. When he returned to check on it, the animal was dead. In that brief window of time, something had descended and performed a complete disembowelment. The entire abdominal cavity had been emptied with the same eerie precision, leaving behind a hollow shell of an animal. The mother cow stood nearby, letting out a sound that Terry would later describe as the hollow lowing, a cry so primal and filled with confusion that it chilled his very marrow. There were no tracks in the soft dirt around the carcass, no footprints of a person, and no paw prints of a wolf. It was as if the calf had been processed by an invisible force that never touched the ground, leaving only the mother's grief. As the months passed, the losses mounted. 14 cattle were taken in just 20 months, a devastating blow to a family whose livelihood was tied to the health of their herd. The financial toll was staggering, with some of the breeding stock valued at over $10,000 per head, but the psychological cost was far greater. Terry and Gwen found themselves living in a state of constant, low-grade terror. Every night, the hollow lowing of the herd would start, and Terry would grab his rifle, venturing out into the darkness only to find nothing but the cold wind. He began to feel that the ranch was not just a piece of property, but a living, breathing predator that was slowly consuming everything they owned. The precision of the cuts, the removal of eyes, tongues, and internal organs without a trace of fluid, suggested an intelligence that was watching them, learning from them, and mocking their attempts at protection with every calculated and bloodless strike that left them broken. They looked for any rational explanation. Could it be cults? Could it be a government experiment? Terry had even seen mysterious lights in the sky, orbs of orange and blue that danced over the ridges, but those lights didn't explain the physical reality of the mutilated flesh. The lack of scavengers was perhaps the most telling detail. Normally, a carcass in the desert would be picked clean by coyotes and vultures within hours. But at Skinwalker Ranch, the local wildlife seemed to know better. Predatory birds would circle high above but never land, and the ranch dogs would whimper and hide in the shadows of the porch rather than investigate the scent of death. The air around the kill sites felt thin, charged with a static energy that made the hair on Terry's arms stand up. It was a silence that spoke of a complete and total absence of the natural order in the basin. The silence of the Uinta Basin is rarely absolute. Usually, there is the dry whistle of wind through the sagebrush or the occasional lowing of a distant calf. But for those living on the ranch, the silence began to take on a heavy, textured quality. It was as if the air itself was waiting for a cue. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows against the red rock ridges, the family began to notice that the anomalies were no longer just something they saw in the sky. They were something they could hear, and eventually, something they could feel pressing against their skin. The shift from the visual to the auditory was subtle at first, a faint vibration that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't long before this vibration transformed into something far more mechanical and intentional. Terry Sherman spent many nights standing on his porch. His eyes scanned the darkness for those elusive orbs, but his ears were what captured the next layer of the mystery. From deep beneath the desert floor, he began to hear the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery. It was a rhythmic, grinding noise, reminiscent of a massive boring machine or a subterranean drill working through layers of solid stone. He would press his ear to the dusty earth, feeling a low-frequency thrumming that resonated in his chest. It made no sense. There were no mining operations in the immediate vicinity, and certainly nothing that would require such massive power in the middle of the night. The sound was industrial, cold, and massive, suggesting that while the surface of the ranch was a simple cattle operation, something else was occurring deep in the bedrock below. He described it as the sound of a city waking up, but a city buried under hundreds of feet of dirt and silence. As the weeks turned into months, the sounds migrated from the earth into the sky. On several occasions, both Terry and Gwen reported hearing disembodied voices speaking in the air directly above them. These weren't the echoes of neighbors or the distant chatter of a radio. The voices seemed to hover approximately 20 or 30 feet in the air, moving through the empty space as if carried by invisible speakers. The language was the most unsettling part. It wasn't English, nor did it resemble the native Navajo or Ute tongues common to the region. It was a rapid, guttural, and highly structured language that sounded like two people in a deep, animated conversation. When Terry would shout out into the darkness, the voices would stop instantly, only to resume minutes later several hundred yards away. It gave the family the terrifying impression that they were being discussed by entities they could not see, right in their own backyard. This auditory invasion was accompanied by a physical sensation that the investigators would later describe as molecular pressure. It was a feeling of the atmosphere thickening, as if the air had suddenly turned to liquid or heavy static. When walking across certain parts of the pasture, particularly near the area known as the Triangle, witnesses felt as though they were pushing through an invisible curtain. Their skin would crawl, and the hair on their arms would stand straight up. This wasn't just fear. It was a localized change in the environment. Some described it as walking into a wall of dense energy that caused a sudden, sharp spike in anxiety and a sense of impending doom. It felt as though the very molecules of the air were being rearranged by an unseen force, creating a barrier that was as much psychological as it was physical. The ranch was no longer just a place of strange sightings. It was becoming a place of sensory distortion. When the National Institute for Discovery Science arrived in 1996, they brought with them an array of sophisticated recording equipment, hoping to capture these echoes. They set up sensitive microphones and seismic sensors, expecting to document the underground grinding and the voices in the sky. However, the phenomenon seemed to play a game of cat and mouse with the technology. On nights when the scientists heard the loud, mechanical clanking with their own ears, the recording tapes would often return nothing but the hiss of empty wind. It was as if the sounds were being projected directly into the human mind, bypassing the physical microphones altogether. This led the team to wonder if the ranch wasn't just haunted by ghosts or visited by aliens, but if it was actually a laboratory where the human consciousness was being tested and manipulated by frequencies we are only beginning to understand. The feeling of being observed became a constant weight. The family felt as though the very ground they walked on was a living, breathing participant in the mystery. Every footstep on the 512 acres felt like it was being logged by a presence that resided in the vibrations of the air. The unseen speakers and the subterranean drills were more than just spooky stories. They were evidence of a reality that refused to stay in the shadows. As the sensory anomalies grew more intense, the family realized that their understanding of the world was being dismantled, one echo at a time. The ranch was speaking, and though they couldn't translate the words, the message was clear. They were no longer the masters of this land. The high desert was holding its breath, and the loudest sounds were the ones that shouldn't have existed at all. The air over the Uinta Basin often feels heavy, like a wet blanket draped across the scrub brush and red rock. On this particular afternoon in the mid-1990s, the heat was a slow, pulsing rhythm against the skin. Terry was a man of the earth, a cattleman who understood the weight and the stubborn reality of living things. He stood by the iron-gated corral, watching his 4 prized bulls. These were not mere livestock. They were the future of his ranch, each one a mountain of muscle weighing nearly 2,000 pounds. They were magnificent, grounding influences in a landscape that had begun to feel increasingly untethered from the world he knew. He checked the latches on the heavy metal gates, hearing the familiar clink of iron on iron. It was a solid sound, a sound of security. In a place where shadows seemed to move with their own intentions, these 4 massive animals represented something tangible and safe. Terry left the corral for only a few minutes, perhaps 10 or 15 at most, to retrieve some equipment from the nearby shed. The ranch was silent, save for the distant whistle of the wind through the sagebrush. There were no sounds of struggle, no frantic bellows, and no heavy thud of hooves against the dry earth. When he returned to the pen, the silence was absolute. He looked through the bars, expecting to see the broad, dusty backs of his bulls, but the enclosure was empty. The iron gate remained locked, its heavy bolt still slid firmly into place. The dust inside the pen was undisturbed, showing only the lingering prints of where the bulls had stood moments before. There were no tracks leading out, no broken fences, and no sign of a breach. It was as if 8,000 pounds of living flesh had simply evaporated into the thin, shimmering air of the desert afternoon. A cold prickle of dread began to crawl up Terry's spine, a sensation that had become all too common on this patch of land. He began to circle the perimeter of the corral, his eyes searching the ground for any clue. In the soft, sandy soil of the ranch, even a coyote leaves a trace, yet there were no deep ruts from a heavy animal jumping a fence, nor any blood or tufts of hair snagged on the wire. He called out, his voice swallowed by the vastness of the basin. The disappearance defied every law of physics he had ever respected. You do not move 4 enormous bulls in silence. You do not move them without leaving a trail. He began to walk toward a small, rusted metal trailer parked several yards away. A cramped container intended for hauling a single horse, or perhaps light equipment. It was a relic of the previous owners, its door wired shut and covered in the undisturbed silver webbing of desert spiders. As he approached the trailer, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The small, frosted windows of the container were clouded with a thick, white vapor, a condensation that shouldn't have existed in the dry heat. He reached for the handle, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. Through the grime of the glass, he saw them. Inside the tiny, claustrophobic space of the trailer, all 4 bulls were standing side by side. It was a physical impossibility. The interior of the trailer was barely large enough to hold 2 of the animals, let alone 4 of that size. They were packed together with a surgical precision, their massive bodies wedged into the corners as if they had been poured into the space like liquid. The door was still locked from the outside, the wire twisted tight, and the ancient cobwebs in the corners remained perfectly intact, unbroken by any entry. But it was the state of the bulls that truly chilled him. They were not panicking. There was no kicking, no snorting, and no frantic movement. They stood in a deathly, hypnotic trance, their eyes wide and staring at nothing. Their breathing was slow, synchronized, and shallow. It was as if they had been placed under a heavy chemical or psychological veil, their very consciousness suspended by an external force. Terry stood there in the silence, the smell of ozone and old metal filling his lungs. He realized then that the ranch was no longer just a place of strange sightings or distant lights. It was a place where the very geometry of our world could be folded and rearranged at will. The bulls had not been walked into that trailer. They had been placed there by something that viewed the physical boundaries of a locked door as nothing more than a suggestion. When the researchers from the National Institute for Discovery Science arrived later to investigate the site, they found evidence that whispered of a high-energy event. The iron bars of the original corral, where the bulls had first stood, were found to be highly magnetized. It was a silent signature of a massive electromagnetic field, a ghost left behind by whatever force had plucked the animals from their pen. The bulls eventually snapped out of their trance, erupting into a violent, terrified rage as they realized the cramped reality of their surroundings, nearly tearing the metal trailer apart in their desperation to escape. The incident marked a terrifying shift for the family and the investigators alike. They were no longer dealing with a predator that hid in the shadows. They were dealing with an intelligence that could manipulate the very fabric of space and time, turning a secure home into a house of glass. By the late summer of 1996, the weight of the ranch had become a physical burden for Terry and Gwen Sherman. They were exhausted, not just from the relentless labor of maintaining 512 acres, but from the psychological toll of the unknown. Imagine the quiet of those final nights. The house, once intended to be a sanctuary for their children and a foundation for their cattle business, had turned into a fortress of locks and anxiety. They moved through the hallways with a heavy silence, their ears always straining for the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof or the distant, metallic hum that often preceded the appearance of the orbs. The cattle they had worked so hard to protect were being taken from them, one by one, in ways that defied every law of nature they understood. It was no longer a question of whether they could succeed as ranchers. It was a question of how much more their spirits could endure before they broke entirely. In September of 1996, a figure emerged from the neon glow of Las Vegas to step into the dust of the Uinta Basin. Robert Bigelow, a billionaire whose fortune was built on real estate and whose dreams were anchored in the stars, had been following the reports of the Shermans' plight. For Bigelow, the ranch wasn't a tragedy to be avoided, but a gold mine of data waiting to be extracted. He met with Terry and Gwen, and for the sum of approximately $200,000, he purchased the property. It was the sale of the century, though not for its price tag. To the Shermans, it was the price of their freedom, a chance to walk away from the shadows. But for the world of the anomalous, it was the moment the ranch transitioned from a family nightmare into a highly classified, privately funded laboratory. The deal was finalized as the autumn winds began to bite, and as the Shermans packed their final boxes, they felt a strange, bittersweet relief. They would stay on for a time as ranch managers, helping the new owners navigate the terrain, but the burden of ownership had finally shifted. The arrival of the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, changed the physical character of the land almost overnight. This was an organization Bigelow had founded in 1995, comprised of PhD scientists, former intelligence officers, and seasoned investigators. They didn't arrive with saddles and ropes. They arrived with crates of thermal imagers, night vision goggles, and electromagnetic field sensors. The old homesteads, which had stood as decaying monuments to the Myers family and the pioneers before them, were suddenly surrounded by high-tensile fencing and warning signs. Mobile command centers, sleek white trailers humming with the sound of cooling fans, were leveled on the uneven ground. High-definition cameras were mounted on poles, their lenses sweeping the horizon 24/7, searching for the flickers of light that had terrified Gwen Sherman. The air, once filled only with the lowing of cattle and the rustle of sagebrush, now carried the faint, rhythmic pulse of electronic monitoring equipment. The ranch had become a living laboratory, a place where the sterile rigor of science attempted to pin down the mercurial nature of the paranormal. Under the direction of scientists like Combe Kelleher, the team began to map the anomalies with the precision of a surgeon. They documented everything. Every sudden drop in temperature, every inexplicable magnetic spike, and every sighting of the massive, bullet-resistant creatures that Terry had described. They sought to turn anecdotes into data points. You can almost see the researchers sitting in the glow of their monitors in the dead of night, the blue light reflecting off their glasses as they watched the infrared feeds of the empty pastures. They were waiting for a door to open, for a portal to shimmer into existence, or for the earth itself to reveal the secrets it had held for generations. But the ranch seemed to know it was being watched. There was a growing sense among the team that the phenomenon was reactive, that it changed its behavior the moment a lens was pointed in its direction. There is a profound irony in this era of the ranch's history. The more technology they brought to bear, the more elusive the truth became. The scientists found themselves caught in a game of cat and mouse with an intelligence that seemed to toy with their expectations. They would find evidence of a cattle mutilation, perfectly executed with surgical precision. Yet the cameras meant to capture the act would experience a simultaneous, inexplicable power failure. They would hear the disembodied voices that the Shermans had reported, but the recordings would return as nothing but static and white noise. The land remained beautiful and stark, the red rock mesas glowing in the sunset, but beneath that beauty, the laboratory felt increasingly like a cage. The researchers began to speak of a hitchhiker effect, a feeling that something from the ranch was following them home, clinging to their clothes and their minds long after they passed through the locked gates. The laboratory was meant to study the ranch, but the ranch was beginning to study the scientists. As the years of the NIDS investigation stretched on, the initial excitement of the purchase gave way to a quiet, persistent frustration. Millions of dollars were spent, and thousands of pages of reports were filed, yet the heart of the mystery remained untouched. The sale of the century had provided the resources, the minds, and the time, but the ranch refused to be solved. It stayed silent when it chose, and screamed when it was least expected. The Shermans eventually moved on to a new life, far from the ridge and the orbs, leaving behind the place that had redefined their reality. The laboratory continued its vigil, a lonely outpost of science in a landscape of myth. We are left to wonder if some things are simply not meant to be measured, or if the act of observing a mystery is what keeps it alive. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The arrival of the National Institute for Discovery Science marked a tectonic shift for the property. No longer was the ranch merely a site of local folklore or private terror. It was now a laboratory. Combe Kelleher, a biochemist with a sharp mind and a penchant for rigorous detail, stepped onto the dusty soil of the Uinta Basin in the late 1990s with a heavy burden of expectation. He brought with him crates of sophisticated technology, each piece of hardware a silent promise that the mystery could be measured, mapped, and eventually mastered. As the dry Utah wind pulled at his jacket, Kelleher looked out over the 512 acres of scrub brush and red rock, seeing not just a landscape, but a complex puzzle of energy and matter. The transition was meticulous. The team began by establishing a permanent presence, turning a modest ranch house into a high-tech nerve center. The air inside the command trailer soon became thick with the smell of ozone and the steady, rhythmic hum of cooling fans. This was the science of the strange, a marriage of hard physics and the deeply inexplicable. The deployment of the surveillance network was an arduous, physical process. Kelleher and his team spent weeks stringing miles of high-grade copper and fiber-optic cables along the fence lines and across the rocky ridges. They installed 360-degree cameras on towering poles, their glass eyes scanning the horizon for any hint of the unusual. Imagine the sound of the metal rungs clinking as they climbed, the grit of the red dust between their teeth, and the weight of the battery packs as they lugged them through the heat of the day. They placed magnetometers in the tall grass to catch fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field and microwave detectors near the spots where the most terrifying encounters had occurred. Every inch of the ranch was being watched. The goal was simple: to create a net so fine that no anomaly, no matter how fleeting, could slip through without leaving a digital fingerprint. They were prepared for anything, or so they believed as they watched the first screens flicker to life in the cool, dark interior of the command center. But the ranch seemed to have a different plan. Almost as soon as the system was fully operational, the science began to fail in ways that defied traditional explanation. Kelleher documented instances where cameras, designed to operate in extreme conditions, would simply go black at the exact moment a light appeared in the sky. When the researchers would race to the site of a malfunction, they wouldn't find a blown fuse or a dead battery. Instead, they would find something far more unsettling. On one occasion, a heavy-duty cable, thick and shielded against the elements, was found to be cleanly severed, as if by a pair of giant, invisible shears. There were no footprints in the soft dirt around the pole, no signs of human or animal interference. The cut was surgical, precise, and impossible. The team began to notice a pattern. The more sophisticated the equipment, the more spectacularly it failed. It was as if the ranch were testing them, learning their capabilities and systematically dismantling their ability to record the truth. The frustration grew like a slow-burning fever among the scientists. They were men of data, yet the data was becoming a ghost. One night, a pair of high-tech infrared cameras were focused on a specific area where activity had been predicted. The monitors showed a clear, moonlit field. Suddenly, the equipment registered a massive spike in magnetic energy, enough to warp the very air. But when the researchers looked at the recorded footage, the cameras had been physically turned away from the event. The heavy mounting brackets had been swiveled on their axes, directed toward the empty ground. No one had been near the poles. The team was left standing in the silence of the desert, staring at a patch of dirt while the anomaly occurred behind the camera's blind spot. This led Kelleher to propose a chilling hypothesis that would haunt the investigation for years: the idea of precognitive sentience. The ranch, or whatever force inhabited it, seemed to know what the scientists were going to do before they did it. It was not a passive mystery to be solved. It was an active participant in the game. The psychological toll of this cat-and-mouse game was profound. The researchers began to feel less like observers and more like subjects in a grand, cosmic experiment. They would spend hours calibrating a specific sensor, only for it to drain of all power the moment they walked away. These batteries, which should have lasted for weeks, would be found at 0% charge within minutes. Kelleher described the sensation of being watched by an intelligence that was always one step ahead, a presence that mocked the rigid structures of human science. The lights on the control boards would blink in sequences that seemed almost like a language, a taunting flicker in the darkness. The team would sit in the command trailer, surrounded by millions of dollars of hardware, feeling completely helpless. They were looking for answers in frequencies and decibels, but the ranch was responding with a silence that felt heavy and intentional. The deeper they pushed into the science of the strange, the more the ranch pushed back, proving that some shadows are not meant to be illuminated by the cold light of a laboratory. By the end of this phase of the investigation, the piles of handwritten logs and digital files told a story of magnificent failure. They had captured glimpses, blurry shapes, unexplained echoes, and sudden temperature drops, but nothing that could be held up as definitive proof in a peer-reviewed journal. The equipment had become a witness to its own inadequacy. Kelleher and his colleagues were left to grapple with the realization that they were dealing with something that operated outside the known laws of physics. The ranch was a place where the observer effect was not just a quantum theory, but a daily reality. As the sun set over the ridges, casting long, purple shadows across the command center, the scientists were forced to wonder. If the ranch really was sentient, what did it want from them? And more importantly, what was it doing to them while they were busy looking through their lenses? The sensors remained silent, the cameras stared into the void, and the mystery of Skinwalker Ranch remained as impenetrable as the mountain stone beneath their feet. The failure of the initial scientific phase was not for lack of effort. but perhaps for lack of a language that could describe what was truly happening. The researchers of the National Institute for Discovery Science had arrived with their spectrometers, their high-speed cameras, and their logical minds, only to find that the ranch seemed to play by rules they could not yet fathom. The air in the Uinta Basin during the late summer is heavy with the scent of dry sagebrush and sun-baked earth, but as night falls, the temperature drops sharply, leaving the desert floor brittle and cold. On the night of August 25, 1997, the darkness felt particularly thick. Two scientists, highly trained and inherently skeptical, were stationed on a ridge overlooking the homestead. They were there to watch, to wait, and to capture the impossible with the cold, unfeeling lenses of their equipment. As they sat in the silence, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of their night vision goggles. To the naked eye, the landscape was a void of charcoal and ink, but through the infrared filters, the ranch became a ghost world of greens and grainy whites. Suddenly, a small, yellowish light flickered into existence approximately 4 feet above the ground. It was faint at first, appearing like what the lead investigator would later describe as a dirty snowball of light. It hung there, suspended in the emptiness, defying the pull of gravity and the logic of their optics. One scientist looked through his high-powered scope, adjusting the focus until the blur sharpened. What he saw was not a solid object or a simple orb. It was a puncture. The light began to expand, pulsing with a dull orange glow that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made the scientists' teeth ache and their skin crawl with static. The orange glow grew wider, stretching into a luminous oval that resembled a tunnel or a gateway. It was as if the very fabric of the Utah sky had been unzipped, revealing a cavity of shimmering, viscous light. Through the infrared goggles, the scientists could see that this was no mere reflection. It possessed a terrifying depth. Inside the orange ring, the darkness was different. It was darker than the desert night, a deep, indigo void that suggested a distant, alien horizon. The light from this portal cast no shadows on the ground below, yet it illuminated the nearby trees with a sickly, amber hue. The men watched, frozen by a mixture of professional discipline and primal fear, as the tunnel stabilized. The edges of the portal rippled like heat, haze rising from a summer road, creating a distortion in space that seemed to bend the stars behind it. Then something began to move within the light. A silhouette emerged from the center of the orange tunnel, pressing against the boundaries of our reality. It was a humanoid figure, but it lacked the familiar markers of a human being. It was massive, perhaps 7 or 8 feet tall, with a muscular, featureless physique that seemed to be carved from solid shadow. It did not step out. It crawled. The researchers watched in stunned silence as the creature reached its thick, dark arms out of the light, gripping the edges of the portal as if pulling its weight through a narrow opening. Its movements were fluid and heavy, reminiscent of a predator stalking through tall grass, but there was an unnatural grace to its struggle. There were no eyes, no nose, and no mouth on its face, only a smooth, black surface that reflected the swirling orange energy of the gateway it was leaving behind. As the entity fully cleared the portal, it dropped to the ground with a soft, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the scientist's feet on the ridge above. For a fleeting second, it crouched in the dirt, its long limbs bent in a way that defied human anatomy. The smell of sulfur and ozone suddenly filled the air, sharp and metallic, cutting through the scent of the dry sage. Before the scientists could even breathe to speak a word of what they were witnessing, the creature lunged forward into the darkness and simply ceased to be. The orange portal, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, collapsed inward on itself. It shrank from an oval to a pinpoint of light in a fraction of a second, vanishing with a faint popping sound that left a ringing silence in its wake. The night vision goggles returned to their flat, grainy green view of an empty field. The men raced down from the ridge, their flashlights cutting frantic paths through the dark as they reached the spot where the creature had landed. They found nothing. There were no footprints in the soft desert soil, no broken branches, and no physical evidence of the massive weight they had just seen drop from the sky. Only the lingering, acrid scent of sulfur remained, slowly dissipating into the cool night breeze. This event, captured in the scientific logs of 1997, became a cornerstone of the ranch's mystery. It challenged the team's entire understanding of physics. They weren't just dealing with unidentified objects in the sky. They were witnessing the intrusion of another dimension entirely. The portal was not a craft, but a doorway, and whatever had walked through it was now somewhere on the ranch, unseen, blending into the shadows that stretched across the basin. The drive away from the Uinta Basin always feels like a slow shedding of weight. As the rugged mesas of the ranch disappear into the rearview mirror, the researchers often speak of a profound physical relief. They imagine the dust of the basin is the only thing they are carrying back to civilization. They believe that by crossing the cattle guard and heading toward the airport in Salt Lake City, they have left the anomalies behind, locked within the 512 acres of barbed wire and mystery. But for many, the relief is a cruel illusion. The desert has a way of clinging. It does not stay in the soil. It weaves itself into the fabric of the mind and the very air of the homes they return to. This is the phenomenon that the investigators eventually came to call the hitchhiker effect. It is the realization that the ranch is not just a place you visit, but a condition you contract. It is a shadowy passenger that waits until you are at your most vulnerable, thousands of miles away, before it finally decides to unpack its bags. Consider the experience of a high-ranking naval intelligence officer who visited the ranch during the height of the government's secret investigations. We will call him Jonathan Axelrod, a pseudonym used to protect a man whose career was built on logic and hard data. After spending only a short time on the property, Jonathan returned to his quiet, suburban home in Virginia, more than 2,000 miles from the Red Rock Canyons of Utah. He expected the hum of his refrigerator and the soft sounds of his neighborhood to ground him. Instead, the silence of his own house began to feel heavy. It started with the small things. A television in a vacant room would click on in the middle of the night, its blue light spilling across the hallway floor. A ceiling fan would begin to spin at maximum speed without anyone touching the switch. At first, he told himself it was the old wiring or a series of strange coincidences. But then, the manifestations became physical. He would feel a sudden, sharp change in air pressure, as if the room had been plunged into a deep vacuum, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps pacing across the floorboards above his head. The true horror of the hitchhiker effect is not what it does to the witness, but what it does to those they love. Jonathan had not told his family the full details of what he saw at the ranch, hoping to shield them from the strangeness. Yet, within 48 hours of his return, the infection spread. His wife, who had never set foot in Utah, began to describe a sensation of being watched by something predatory. One evening, while she was in the garden, she saw a large, wolf-like creature standing near the edge of the woods. It did not move like a natural animal. It stood with a terrifying, humanoid posture, its eyes reflecting a dull, sickly light. When she called out, it simply faded into the shadows of the trees. Soon, their children began to wake up in the dead of night, claiming that a tall man in a dark cloak was standing in the corner of their bedrooms. They described him as a shadow that was more solid than the darkness around it, a three-dimensional void that seemed to absorb the light from their nightlights. This was no longer a scientific investigation. It was a domestic haunting that followed no known rules of physics. In the neon-soaked suburbs of Las Vegas, the journalist George Knapp found that even he was not immune. After his numerous visits to the ranch, his wife began to report seeing brilliant blue orbs of light floating just outside their bedroom window. These were the same orbs that had been seen dancing over the ridges of the Uinta Basin, thousands of feet above the ground. Now, they were hovering in a residential neighborhood, silent and watchful. Other researchers reported that their specialized equipment, designed to measure radiation and magnetic fields, would suddenly spike while sitting on their kitchen tables in distant states. It was as if the phenomena was mocking their attempts at containment. Dr. Combe Kelleher, a biochemist who spent years leading the scientific team, eventually concluded that the ranch behaved more like a biological pathogen than a haunting. He suggested that by interacting with the ranch, the human immune system, or perhaps the human consciousness, is altered, making the individual a carrier. You become a beacon, a living portal that allows the shadows to bypass the barriers of distance and time. The psychological weight of this realization is staggering. Robert Bigelow, the billionaire who owned the ranch for 2 decades, eventually reached a breaking point. Despite his vast resources and his passion for the unexplained, he saw the toll the hitchhiker was taking on his own family and the government contractors he employed. He realized that no amount of security guards or high-tech cameras could protect a home 3 states away. Some reports suggest that the decision to sell the ranch in 2016 was driven by a sense of ethical responsibility. How can you ask a scientist to study a mystery if that mystery will follow them home and stand over their child's bed? The ranch is not a cage. It is a source. It is an infection of reality that suggests we are never truly alone, and that some doors once opened can never be fully closed. As you lie there tonight, breathe in the stillness of your own room. Listen to the house settle. In the world of the hitchhiker, every creak of the floorboard and every flicker of a light is a reminder that some shadows do not need a map to find where you sleep. The psychological weight of this realization is staggering. Robert Bigelow, the billionaire who owned the ranch for 2 decades, eventually reached a threshold where private curiosity was no longer enough. The mystery was too vast for one man, even one with his immense resources. We transition now from the quiet, private watch of the desert to the echoing, windowless corridors of the Pentagon. Imagine the shift in atmosphere. Move away from the scent of sagebrush and the dry, biting cold of the Utah night, and find yourself instead among the hum of server banks and the sterile, fluorescent glow of government offices. Here, in the year 2007, a new chapter began for the ranch. It was no longer just a site of local legend or a rich man's hobby. It was becoming a matter of national security, discussed in hushed tones by men who dealt in the hard currency of defense and intelligence. The transition was subtle at first, a ripple in the bureaucratic pond that would eventually grow into a tidal wave of disclosure. At the center of this shift was a man named James Lakatsky. He was a rocket scientist for the Defense Intelligence Agency, a man trained to look at the world through the lens of physics and tangible threats. Lakatsky had read a book about the ranch, a detailed account of the events that had unfolded there under Bigelow's watch. He didn't see a ghost story. He saw a series of incursions into American airspace by objects and forces that defied every known law of aerodynamics. He saw a potential technological gap that the United States could not afford to ignore. Lakatsky, driven by a mixture of scientific rigor and profound wonder, decided to visit the property himself. He didn't go as a tourist. He went as an investigator for the most powerful military on Earth, seeking to understand if the shimmering lights and mutilated cattle were signs of a terrestrial adversary or something much further beyond our reach. The funding for what would follow was not a simple matter of writing a check. It required the political weight of giants. Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, a longtime friend of Bigelow, became the primary architect of the program. He wasn't alone. He reached out to Senators Ted Stevens and Daniel Inouye, powerful men who understood the necessity of exploring the unknown. Together, they secured $22 million. In the world of government budgets, it was a modest sum, a drop in an ocean of billions, but for the study of the paranormal, it was unprecedented. This was the birth of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. The name was carefully chosen to be both accurate and inconspicuous. It suggested a focus on hardware and weaponry, a shield against the questions of those who might find the study of portals and poltergeists to be frivolous or absurd. But behind that title, the ranch was about to become the most scrutinized piece of land in the history of the modern world. The contract for this work was awarded in 2008 to a new entity created by Bigelow called Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BAASS. This organization was designed to be the bridge between the ranch's chaos and the DIA's order. They were the only bidders for the contract, a fact that would later raise eyebrows among government watchdogs. But at the time, there was no one else equipped to handle the strange realities of the Uinta Basin. The ranch was viewed as a living laboratory. The goal was no longer just to witness. It was to interact, to measure, and to analyze. The investigators were told to maintain the utmost secrecy. They were instructed to blend in with the local oil workers, to never speak the name of their sponsor, and to treat every shadow and flicker of light as a data point in a grand, cosmic puzzle. The silence of the desert was now backed by the silence of a top-secret classification. James Lakatsky's own experience at the ranch is one of the most compelling pieces of this era. During a visit to the main house, in the very kitchen where the previous owners had once lived in fear, Lakatsky reportedly witnessed a technological apparition. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. He described a complex, three-dimensional geometric shape, resembling a tubular metallic structure, just hanging in the air. It was silent, defying gravity, a piece of impossible architecture manifest in a mundane domestic setting. It wasn't there for long, but it was enough. For a rocket scientist from the Defense Intelligence Agency, this wasn't an hallucination. It was a demonstration. It solidified his belief that the ranch was not just a place of high strangeness, but a gateway to a level of physics that we were only beginning to imagine. This single moment helped propel the program forward, ensuring that the $22 million would be used to document every anomaly with clinical precision. Under the AAWSAP program, the data collection was immense. We are talking about thousands of pages of reports. 88 separate documents were eventually produced, totaling approximately 7,000 pages of analysis. They looked at everything, from the famous Tic Tac incident off the coast of California to the strange biological effects on the ranch's security guards. They categorized the hitchhiker effect, where researchers found that the phenomena followed them home, haunting their families and disrupting their lives long after they left the desert. The government was looking for a weapon, or perhaps a defense against one, but what they found was a tapestry of the impossible. They studied warp drives, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions. They were trying to build a map of a territory that didn't appear on any world globe. Every page of those reports, often bound in simple charcoal folders, represents a moment where the most powerful intelligence agency in the world had to admit that they were standing in the presence of something they could not control. The program officially ran until 2010, though its echoes continued for years under different names and different leadership. The funding eventually dried up, not because the mystery was solved, but because the political climate changed. Harry Reid would later remark that the investigation had only scratched the surface of what the Pentagon truly knew. The ranch had served its purpose as a catalyst, pulling the government out of its shell of denial and forcing it to look directly into the eyes of the unknown. As the BAASS investigators packed their equipment and the DIA officers returned to their desks in Virginia, they left behind a legacy of questions that remain unanswered to this day. The secret was out of the bottle, even if the public wouldn't hear about it for another decade. The transition from private ranch to a national security priority was complete, and the shadows of the Uinta Basin were now part of the permanent record of the United States of America. The year 2016 marked a quiet but profound shift in the history of the 512 acres known as Skinwalker Ranch. Robert Bigelow, the man who had spent 2 decades chasing shadows with government funding and private security, decided it was time to step away. He sold the property to a man named Brandon Fugal, a prominent real estate mogul from Utah who initially approached the land with the cold, calculating eye of a skeptic. Fugal did not believe in ghosts or ancient curses. He was a man of commerce and concrete facts, yet he felt a strange pull toward the mystery of the Uinta Basin. He wanted to do what no one else had managed to achieve, to apply the full force of modern, transparent science to the ranch and finally debunk the legends or capture the truth. He assembled a team of experts, including the chief scientist Eric Bard and eventually the astrophysicist Travis Taylor, bringing in a new era of high-tech surveillance. They built a command center they call the War Room, a sterile, glowing hub of technology that stands in stark contrast to the ancient, rugged desert outside. Here, among banks of computer monitors and interactive displays, they watch the land with thermal cameras, magnetometers, and satellite uplinks, waiting for the shadows to move. As the sun dips below the horizon of the Uinta Basin, the sandstone mesa turns a deep, bruised purple. The air grows cold, and the silence of the high desert is heavy, broken only by the low, electrical hum of the ranch's sensors. Under Fugal's leadership, the investigation has become a massive data project, an attempt to map the invisible. They have documented things that defy the known laws of physics. One of the most persistent and unnerving anomalies is a recurring radio signal at exactly 1.6 gigahertz. This specific frequency is often used for satellite communication, yet on the ranch, it seems to broadcast from the ground itself or from the empty air above the mesa. It is a rhythmic, repeating pulse that appears whenever something strange is about to happen. It feels less like random interference and more like a heartbeat, or perhaps a warning. Travis Taylor has launched countless rockets into the sky above a section of the ranch known as the Triangle, attempting to stimulate a response from whatever might be hidden there. Often, the sky responds. Drones fall from the air as if hitting an invisible ceiling, their global positioning systems failing instantly, and unidentified aerial phenomena appear as shimmering distortions in the light of day. The physical toll of the ranch has also been documented with clinical precision. This is not just a place of stories, it is a place of physical consequences. Investigators have suffered from sudden, unexplained radiation burns and bouts of nausea that strike without warning. In the War Room, gamma-ray detectors occasionally spike to dangerous levels for no apparent reason, as if an invisible source of energy has just brushed past the researchers. There is a weight to the air in certain spots, a feeling of being watched by something that does not have eyes. Brandon Fugal himself, once the ultimate skeptic, had his own world upended when he witnessed a silver, disc-shaped object hovering silently above the mesa in broad daylight. It was an experience that transformed the ranch from a business acquisition into a personal quest for understanding. Yet, the more data they gather, the more elusive the answer becomes. They have drilled into the mesa, only to have their equipment stop cold at exactly 12 feet, hitting something so hard it shredded the drill bits. They have used ground-penetrating radar to find what looks like a massive metallic object buried deep within the stone. But the ranch seems to protect its secrets with a layer of technological interference that scrambles even the most advanced tools. There is a phenomenon often discussed by those who spend time on the land, known as the hitchhiker effect. It is the chilling idea that the ranch does not stay at the ranch. Multiple investigators and visitors have reported that after leaving the 512 acres, the strange activity follows them home. Poltergeist activity, shadow figures in their hallways, and strange lights in their own backyards hundreds of miles away. It suggests that whatever is occurring in the Uinta Basin is not just a localized anomaly, but something that can attach itself to a human consciousness. This brings us back to the ancient name of the property. The Ute people and the Navajo have long spoken of the Skinwalker, a malevolent shapeshifter born of a curse. To the indigenous people of this valley, the ranch is not a laboratory or a curiosity. It is a place of darkness that should be avoided at all costs. They believe the veil between worlds is thin here, and that by poking and prodding at the land with rockets and lasers, the modern scientists are only inviting more trouble. They speak of a portal, a doorway in the sky that opens to let things in and out, a concept that modern astrophysics is only just beginning to entertain through the theory of wormholes and extra dimensions. Tonight, the ranch remains under the watchful eyes of cameras and guards, a fortress of science in a land of myth. The mystery of Skinwalker Ranch has survived the cattle ranchers of the 1930s, the terrified Sherman family of the 1990s, the secret government programs of the 2000s, and now the sophisticated efforts of the present day. It is a case that never closes because every answer reveals 10 more questions. Perhaps some things are meant to remain unknown, a reminder that the universe is far larger and more mysterious than our instruments can measure. We look for a truth that stays just out of reach, flickering like a light on the distant mesa. But for now, the sensors are quiet, and the desert wind has died down. The stars above the Uinta Basin are bright and steady, watching over the silent sandstone. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.